Prices are rising. Inflation is already well above target in most countries. In the US, for example, it stands at 8.5%. And in Switzerland too, inflation is too high at 2.4%. And inflation is trending upwards. Central banks can break this momentum. To do this, they have to slow down the economy with interest rate hikes. We know that. But is it enough for central banks to just tap the brakes? Or does monetary policy have to hit the brakes really hard to bring inflation back under control? We don't know that for sure. But now, new research from the US believes to have found an answer. In essence, it's about the slope of the so-called Phillips Curve, and whether this slope is actually so meaningful. Is there a need for significant interest rate hikes? Will there be a recession, or do central banks also bring inflation under control with other means? Find out now in the Geldcast update.
Geldcast Update mit Fabio Canetg.
He is New Zealand's most famous economist. His name is William Phillips. He lived from 1914 to 1975, fought for the Allies in World War II, and spent over 3 years of his life as prisoner of war. One of the most famous curves in economics is named after him. It's the Phillips Curve. It describes how inflation and unemployment are related. You can now see the Phillips Curve for Switzerland. Each of the dots in this graph represents a month from 1975 to 1989. And what is striking? With low inflation, unemployment was usually high, and with high inflation, unemployment was usually low. In other words, there is a negative correlation between unemployment and inflation. This relationship was strongly negative until 1989. A slight increase in unemployment has greatly reduced inflation. A mini economic crisis has therefore been enough to bring inflation back down. This is the common interpretation of the Phillips curve. Since 1982 and especially since 1993, Switzerland's Phillips curve has changed dramatically. You can see this in the newly displayed points for the years 1993 to 2020. The Phillips curve became much flatter. What does that mean? Suddenly central banks had to raise unemployment sharply to bring inflation just a bit down. Tapping the monetary policy brakes was no longer enough to keep inflation under control. That's the usual interpretation of the Phillips curve. The problem is that these interpretations are wrong. Let's take a closer look. When do prices rise? From a theoretical perspective, there are roughly speaking 2 reasons for inflation. We already know the first one. Products and services become more expensive whenever workers become more expensive. And workers become more expensive when they are scarce. That is, when unemployment is low. Low unemployment equals high inflation. That's what the Phillips curve says. But there's a second reason for high inflation. High inflation expectations. The logic here is that anyone who believes that prices are rising demands compensation for this. So if you think that next year everything will be 10% more expensive, you are much more likely to demand a raise from your employer. And that actually makes products and services more expensive. In other words, the Phillips curve only shows half of the truth. It says inflation falls when unemployment rises, but it neglects inflation expectation. That's why the common interpretation of the Phillips curve, as we did in the beginning, is wrong. If you want to interpret the Phillips curve correctly, you first have to isolate the inflation expectation effect on inflation. And that's exactly what US economist Emi Nakamura and her colleagues did in a new research paper. The main result? Unemployment has never played a major role in determining inflation, not even in the past. The Phillips curve has always been flat. Inflation expectations are the most important driver of inflation. What do we learn from this for today's monetary policy? There's a good news and a bad news. Let's start with the good one. If inflation expectations remain stable, there is no need for a central bank-induced economic crisis to bring inflation back down. A slight tap on the monetary policy brakes should do the trick. The bad news is that if inflation expectations rise sharply, then central banks will have to raise interest rates sharply. Then it would take an economic crisis brought about by central banks to bring inflation back down. So it all depends on how inflation expectations develop. Thanks for tuning in.
Geldcast Update mit Fabio Canetg.
This has been a Geldcast Update request initiated by Lukas Schmid. He asked me to talk about the Phillips curve on the show, and I'm always happy to do that. If you also have inputs for the Geldcast, I'm happy to include them. Write me on Twitter or on LinkedIn. And now one last bit for you to take away for your lunch break or evening walk. You may have noticed that I've only talked about the data points until 2020. That was enough to explain the logic behind the Phillips curve, but there is something interesting in the data. Since the outbreak of the pandemic, the Swiss Phillips curve has become steeper again. Question is, of course, why is this? Feel free to write me your thesis. I'm curious to hear your explanation for it.